Hello, I'm Dr. Cynthia Franklin with the University of Texas at Austin Steve Hicks School of Social Work. I'm here today with two of my colleagues, also from the Steve Hicks School of Social Work, and that's Jack Nowicki and Weiwen Zeng. And we're here to talk to you about helping people respond to crisis. In this training video, we will basically be doing three things. We'll be telling you how to manage a crisis, number one. We'll be telling you how to have a solution-focused conversation and how to ask questions where you can help your congregation in a crisis. And number three, we'll be offering you some resources and where you can learn more and some things that you can do that will help you in the process of managing the crisis with your congregations. When we first did this video, we sent it into mainland China, right into the first epicenter, right into ground zero, where people were working with the virus. And Weiwen was on the front lines, where he was actually working with people, mainly social workers, but some medical professionals too, supervising them, helping them, working with people that were infected and affected by the virus. So I'm going to turn it over to him. He will be able to give you some tips about what he learned in that process of working with the people in mainland China. Weiwen?
Thank you, Dr. Franklin, and hello, everyone. It was a great experience of working with both Dr. Franklin and also Professor Jack Nowicki in developing and delivering the crisis intervention to social workers in China. So why did we decide to do this training? Back in late January, when the outbreak just started in Wuhan, China, my colleagues and friends in Hong Kong told me that around 200 social workers, medical professionals, and volunteers were planning to help families and individuals affected by the virus via a popular online app, which is called WeChat. They invited me to become their clinical supervisor. And it was back then that I decided to chip in and try to help those who work frontline. I started to supervise a team of around 10 social workers in Wuhan. And during a lot of my supervision sessions with these social workers and volunteers, I realized that outbreak presented such a big crisis for so many families and individuals, and that everyone, including those affected and also those infected, and also social workers and medical professionals, were in such a huge need for crisis intervention. Many of them show symptoms such as distressed. They also experience acute anxiety, sleeping disorder, eating disorder, and even depression. Many lost their family members to the disease, and many more were also desperately seeking medical and social resources in helping themselves and also people around them. It was such a critical time that it got me to think what we can do from a distance, to help people through online platforms. So that was why I contacted Dr. Franklin and also Professor Jack Nowicki to seek their expertise. I was really happy that they almost immediately responded and were willing to help me put up this training for the social workers. Other Chinese doctoral students at the Steve Hicks School of Social Work also offered us generous help in organizing the training. So we delivered the training to around 200 social workers and medical professionals on March 11th. And that training was a huge success. We received a lot of great feedback from our trainees. And well, I think a learning for me and maybe for all of us here is the importance of having hope in life. I learned this from many social workers and including families. Even in an emergent situation like the COVID-19 pandemic, people need to have hope to envision a better life that is, that is that is better than what they currently having, because we tend to feel helpless when we are being alone and left behind. I have heard a lot of heartbreaking stories during my supervision, but I have also heard even more stories of resilience, stories of people getting back to normal life after they made it through the most difficult time with the help of others. I really think that it is critical for community organizations such as churches, non-governmental and not-for-profit organizations in responding to the needs of community in a prompt manner. I appreciate you considering people's needs and gives us the chance to do this training. And I really think that the work that you have done and the work that you're doing right now matters to so many lives in the US and around the world. So thank you for everything. And I wish everybody can go through this pandemic as soon as possible. Thank you.
Hello, I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague, Jack Nowicki. And Jack is going to be talking to you about how to manage a crisis and the stages of crisis. Jack?
Let's go ahead for a couple more slides. There you go. So basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about the foundations of crisis intervention theory. And this is material that is research informed and kind of sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about later on, which has to do with talking to people about their crisis. We're using information from Carl Slyke, who wrote a crisis intervention book a number of years ago. Basically, a definition of a crisis is a temporary state of disorganization characterized by the person's inability to cope using their normal problem-solving methods. So there's basically two types of crisis. One is a situational crisis, which is accidental or unexpected, kind of like the coronavirus, or like a car accident, or a sickness, or finding out that you're getting a divorce, things like that. There's also a developmental crisis. Developmental crises are predictable and they're based on transitional types of situations. In the case of, say, a divorce, there's a situational crisis in the fact that when the person finds out they're getting divorced. And then the developmental part of the crisis has to do with adjusting their lifestyle as they begin to live again as a separate person. With the coronavirus, an example of a developmental crisis might be that the person finds out that they may be infected, or they worry about, have anxiety about all the changes that are happening with the way the situation is this week in the United States. And that's the situational crisis. Then at some point they find out that they have the virus, and then there's a whole developmental phase about how do they adjust to that, how do they begin healing, how does the healing go on after they get back into society, things like that. So basically, situation and developmental. Effects of crisis are that a person becomes disorganized and is in disequilibrium. Their coping strategies basically fall apart when they're in crisis, because they're not used to using, or their normal ways of coping are overtaken by the current crisis. So some of the effects are they're tired, they're helpless, they become anxious, they can be confused, they can have physical symptoms. One of the things we know is that the immune system may not operate as well, which of course leaves them open to other kinds of medical problems. And the bad news about the effects of crisis is that the people in crisis are more likely to have a poor outcome. And yet the good news about people in crisis is that they become less defensive and more willing to make a change, where, before the crisis, they may say, I'm not willing to change anything. Upon having a crisis, people are willing to consider alternatives that they may not have been willing to consider in the past. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, I have a brief activity here that I would like you all to participate in. And I would like for you to remember a crisis that you survived. One that is over and done with, such that you're now totally neutral about it. And at the time you were in crisis and you had to begin to cope with it, and then ultimately you resolved it. You can do this activity by yourself, or if you're in a training or a group of people that are watching this video, you can also do it with someone else. It's important not to tell the other person what your crisis was. What we want you to do is we want you to think about the very first things you did to cope with the crisis. Not what you did to solve the crisis, what you did to begin to restore coping so that you were more in a resource state so that you could begin to work on solution. So I want you to write down the best things you did to cope with the crisis. Take a few minutes to make that list while I go on to the next slide. In assessing crisis, what we're doing is we're determining which variables precipitated the crisis, which can be mobilized to facilitate change, and which ones are maintaining the crisis. So you have a precipitating event. There's always onset of crisis being tied to an event or a trauma, or what the person thinks of as the last straw in a series of stressful events. How people respond to a crisis is determined by their personal, their material, and their social resources. The more resources a person has, the easier it is for them to reestablish coping after the crisis. Our tasks, or your tasks as a pastoral care provider, include identifying what the precipitating event is. What is it that caused you to have contact with that person? And help the person being very specific about the timeline, the behaviors, their thoughts, and their feelings related to the crisis. As far as resources go that we want to call upon, a person's personal resources include perseverance, ingenuity, optimism, maturity, intelligence, and their character. A person's material resources include things like their money, their insurance, whether or not they have money, in the bank, any other kinds of economic kinds of resources. And of course, their social resources include their family, their friends, their colleagues, their spiritual connection to a church or a community, and their strong social support systems. Next slide, please. Okay. Let's speak a little bit about level of coping. Research that's been done in the distant past has identified characteristics of effective coping. And so our primary job with people is to help them restore equilibrium or get back to effective coping so that they can put their full resources on finding solutions to the crisis. A person's level of coping is very important so that they're clear-headed about the solutions. Effective coping is defined as searching for information, expressing positive and negative feelings, tolerating frustration, looking for help from others, breaking problems down into smaller bits, being aware of fatigue, pacing efforts, being flexible and willing to change, trusting in oneself and others, and having a basic optimism, or as Weiwen said, hope about the future. As pastoral care providers, what you want to do is determine what the coping skills are that the person is already using. We look for and ask about their positive coping skills. And then if we find that something they're doing is already on that list of characteristics of effective coping, then we want to help them to accentuate or amplify that idea, because we already know that it's part of effective coping. So when the person comes up and you're asking them, you know, what are they doing already to cope with the crisis? And they say something like, well, I talk to my sister every day. We can say, oh, is that helpful? Yes, that's very helpful. And find out what it is about that that's helpful. Next slide, please. Another important thing with crisis intervention theory is always being aware for and listening for clues to physical danger, either to the person or to someone else. That's about psychological first aid, and it's in the field of reducing lethality. We want to make sure that people's psychological stability hasn't deteriorated to where they're a danger to themselves or others. And so you want to make sure that you're following your agency's protocol or your congregation protocol, your own policies for reporting danger to self or others, as well as your own values as a pastoral care worker. All crises have two phases. They are acute states, which means that they don't last forever. They have two phases. The first one we've been talking about already here is restoring equilibrium, using their coping skills, getting back to a state of coping skills, and that can usually be restored within 6 weeks. Of course, in this environment with the coronavirus, 6 weeks may have them still in the coping arena as opposed to looking for solutions. But in general, the research suggests that within 6 weeks, people, 70% of the time, have restored equilibrium. The next phase is resolving the crisis, and that can take from months to years to resolve. Go to the next slide. Our goals in crisis intervention are to help the person, number one, help the person use their effective coping to restore equilibrium and return to their pre-crisis level of functioning. That does not mean that they solve all their problems. It means that they go back to the pre-crisis level of functioning. And of course, number two, facilitating the person's efforts to resolve the crisis and integrate it into their life in a meaningful way. When we've done a good job of helping people restore equilibrium, many times they will invite us to work with them to resolve the crisis. So the provider tasks at this stage or at this phase are identifying the person's strengths and resources, helping them put those into play, things they can do more of, less of, or different, and things that can lead them to prepare to resolve and integrate the crisis into their life. I have the next slide. Okay, I have a couple charts here I'm going to go over real quickly. The first chart is phase 1 of crisis intervention, which I've already talked about as establishing effective coping, also known as psychological first aid. It includes things like explaining limits of confidentiality, the extent of the kind of services we can provide, helping the person restore equilibrium and coping skills, giving them support and encouragement, reducing lethality, and helping to any other linking resources we can find. Next slide, please. Phase 2 of crisis intervention is short-term counseling that extends beyond effective coping to helping the person resolve the crisis. This includes, once they're coping better with it, working through the crisis event, establishing openness and readiness to face the future, making necessary adjustments required for future living, and most importantly, integrating the event into the fabric of the person's life so that they see it as a resource as opposed to every time they think about it, it takes them back to the crisis. Generally, in crisis intervention and brief work, we want to work with people from 60 to 90 days. However, resolution of crises is partially cultural and partially physiological, and it can take months to years. Conversations with people in crisis. When we're talking to people in crisis, how we ask questions determines how people answer. The direction of our questions influence the person's focus on possibilities for solution. We want to do things like specify what the problem is and what their best hope is for meeting with us. What are the things they want to continue? What are the things that are not impacted by the crisis? What are they doing today that they want to continue doing? What has worked in the past? What have they already tried? What do they want to be different? And how will they know that things have improved? At this point, Cynthia is going to talk a bit more about the kinds of questions that we use in the solution-focused approach to working with people in crisis. Cynthia?
Yes, thank you. And next slide. And as I talk about solution-focused conversations and asking questions, I want to emphasize what Jack already told you, and that is we need to establish coping before we can get to actually getting someone to build a solution in their life. And we also need to pay very close attention to words that people are using in their conversations about their life. And we need to use those words back to those people. We need to understand that words have different meanings. And in the solution-focused counseling, which Jack and I have been a part of doing and training, and I've also been a part of really being a researcher that pioneered it across the world. In that type of counseling approach, words are very powerful. And the way we use words to connect them to what people are saying and to build hope and to build expectation for change. In your world, it might be thinking about building faith even for change. That is very important to solution-focused counseling. So I'm going to tell you some specific types of questions and ways to work with people that could help you so that your congregation members could cope better and that they could actually resolve the crisis as well. Next slide, please. There are basically 3 types of questions that we use in crisis intervention and solution-focused brief therapy. One of the types of questions is what we call validating and joining. You will be familiar with this because you're used to having empathy and using active listening and things like that with your congregation. The other type, second here, is change difference questions. And this, I'm going to really dwell today on the exceptions questions and also how to set goals, because this is very important to solution-focused counseling. And I'm also going to be talking to you about acceptance and coping questions, because this fits with what Jack was talking about. And it also fits with what Weiwen was talking about building hope. You know, in the Bible, it says that we have to be anchored in hope. And so I think you can use scriptures like that also to help your congregation and help yourself realize that even in the face of the worst crisis, the worst fears, or anxiety or depression, we still have to be able to, as providers, as pastoral care providers, help people be anchored in hope. So next slide, please. In the solution-focused brief therapy model, we actually think about this diagram here, which has been helpful to people. And that is basically being able to bring strengths into a solution. And so instead of dwelling a lot on a person's past difficulties, we tend to use the past difficulties to help people understand how they have gotten through difficult situations and how that they, have been able to cope in the past, as Jack mentioned. And we also focus on how to think about possible change that can, as you move forward. I think the way to really put this into the pastoral counseling setting too is to really think about all of these things that we're going through now can strengthen us. We can be better through adversity. And so we want people to realize that in themselves and make these points of crisis like we're going through now with the coronavirus as points of spiritual transformation and growth. And this is the way we think about this too. We want people to come out on the other side more hopeful, more confident, and seeing the crisis as something that made them a better person. And that's what we're doing with solution-focused counseling by using words and building hope and leading people toward strengths in their difficulties instead of just dwelling on the difficulties themselves. Next slide, please. So let's start with some questions. Some questions that we can actually use. Jack told you about, the importance of specifying problems and the importance of coping. These are questions that you can actually use with people that will help them do just that. Look at this question here. When the problem is solved, what will you be doing instead? Now, this question asks people to focus off of problems onto a different way of responding or thinking or feeling. That's an important question for helping people think through in a different way what they need to be doing to establish coping, even in the situation that they're in. How will others know the problem is solved? This is a question that you can also ask. And what have you tried before and how was that helpful? Jack mentioned that question to you. That's a very good question to really start with, when you're talking to people. After you establish validation with them, which you have to do first, then to ask this question here, what have you tried before and how was it helpful? And then make a list of coping strategies also, or have a person do that, for themselves. That's a good thing to ask people to go away with. Think about what you're doing well. Think about, your coping strategies that you have already, and you can send them away, even making a list and coming back with you, talking to you about it, or talking to someone that's a friend or someone that's supporting them through the crisis in the church. When I get to know you better, what will I come to admire about your abilities to handle the situation? I really like that question because it asks people to focus on themselves and, focus on some things that they're doing well and doing right. And that also can establish the coping. That's a very powerful question that we can ask. So let me move on and let's look at some other questions that we use, future and exceptions questions. And I'll give you some examples of these these kinds of questions as well, but more in the context maybe that you are really, experiencing, trying to support people. When we start with a future-oriented question, we basically want people to tell us, what we could do today to really help this person. A lot of times when people will come in, if you were ask them for a goal, for example, or ask them, what do you want to happen? They might say something like, in your current situation, well, I just want this epidemic to end. I just want the virus to go away. I just wish my children could go back to school. I just wish that, we could have the church services again. And so they'll bring situations like that to you. But what you want to do then is think about how to make that more immediate than these big things that obviously can't happen immediately. Because remember, Jack was talking about how that when the crisis is very large, people are overwhelmed by it. They don't think clearly, and they can't think their way through, everyday crisis situations, or little smaller crises that they need to be solving because they're too focused on the big crises, and they're too fearful about the big crises. So we can convert, questions like that, for example, to something like that. We can support the person. First of all, do the validation, say, okay, this is very difficult that we can't have the church services right now. This is very hard on us all. We're all very stressed by that the church services are not going on. However, I wonder, while we're chatting today or while we're talking and praying together today, what could happen here? What needs to happen right now, here today, that would be helpful in your current situation? So, or you could think about this question that's already on here. You're very worried about your children getting sick. Tell me something when you worry less and enjoy your children. So these are just the kinds of things that we would bring into the situation. And this last question that I'm talking to you about is what we call an exception question. And I want to talk to you about the exception questions because they're very helpful in getting people out of depression and anxiety. The solution-focused brief therapy that we're using here to talk to you about how to talk to people is very good at getting people out of depression, anxiety, and stress and working in a crisis. We have many, many research studies on it that show that it's effective in this regard. So a question like an exception question, like we have here on the screen, can be very helpful to getting people to think differently, to get people to really concentrate on, what is working in their lives and get them to think differently about their situation and even to recognize the strengths and the coping that they already have. So let me give you some examples of exception questions that would be in your situation. Example would be, you're very worried because we can't visit your mom in the nursing home. I hear that all the time from people. In fact, myself, I even have someone that's my good friend now that has a person in Seattle in a long-term care facility. And she is not able to visit her mother, even though the COVID-19 virus is all over that long-term care facility, and they will not test the residents. And her mom is locked into a room in there. This is a very difficult, situation that she's in. And so you want to empathize with someone in that situation, and then step into a exception question. This is how we can be most useful and helpful. So we would, empathize with someone like that. This is a horrible situation. You must be just worried to death about your mother. You are so stressed through this. And then we would basically say, well, what are some times that you're a little less worried and overwhelmed with fear about your mother? Tell me some times that you thought of some ways of making contact with her, and maybe you've been able to have some contact, even though it may be just a little bit of a contact. And so we would say that because that's helpful to the person then. Instead of just being overwhelmed by their fear and their anxiety, then all at once they can think about something useful and helpful in which they might be able to do in their current situation, which is the purpose of exception questions. Really, is to think about, what you can do, even though the situation is not changing, what can you do in your current situation and what makes the situation better? in your current situation, and what some coping and abilities that you maybe even didn't recognize in yourself, and you can talk to the person about that, and that's helpful. Let me give you another example that I've heard from people as well. I've heard feeling alone because they're alone a lot and can't connect with people in the same way. In your situation, that might be somebody missing their home groups, missing the church services. It might be someone, you know, that can't really, is afraid even to come out of the home. Some older people are very afraid now to come out of their homes because of this epidemic, and because they're glued to the news all the time. And so this is very difficult on them. So you, again, will have to empathize with someone like that. You have to find a way of making that emotional connection where you're letting them know you care for them and that you're understanding their situation. But then you can step into a more exception question. Yes, it's hard to be away from all your friends at the church, for example. But what makes you feel less alone? See, that's the exception question. What makes you feel less alone? And then people might come up with different kinds of things. You know, for example, like they may say, well, watching the messages online makes me feel less alone. Talking to people in the church on the phone, praying and feeling the presence of God, that makes me feel less alone. And then you would want to reinforce those types of exceptions, doing more of that in their lives, and you know, and also ask them what else. That's the thing you can do. You can build on that. What else? What else makes you feel less alone? And then when you do that, you can come up with a whole list of things that can be really helpful to your congregation or to the person that you're talking to at the time. So another one I hear is you have to work and your kids are at home. And you know, what people really say is, my kids are driving me crazy. You know, and you know, they're also thinking, why can't we go to McDonald's? You know, why can't we go to the playground? Why can't we even go to the Starbucks or do something? I wish I could do that, you know, but they'll be saying, like, I'm working at home with my kids, and that is very difficult. Have you heard that one before? I think you probably have. So you can certainly, again, what are you going to do? You're going to use the validation first. You're going to empathize. You're going with the person that's talking. You're going to relate to them. You might be able to relate to them yourself. Your kids may be driving you crazy. So just say that to them. And then you can say something like, what has worked to make things even a little bit better with your working at home with your kids? What have you done? You know, and so they might come up with things. I've heard people come up with things. They'll say, well, I try to create a separate place to school them, for example, than where I'm working and where we eat and, you know, have our family time. I try to make it like a game. We dress up as characters while I'm homeschooling the child now. You know, I think it's been really helpful. The schools provided some meals and the educational materials. They'll say things like that. And so these are exceptions then that they're creating, you know, that can also be built on. Next slide, please. So other questions you can use that are very important is to get to more strengths in coping and really assisting your congregational members going through a crisis are these scaling questions where you can build on strengths with people and also help them think about what they need to do next to make things better. The scaling question is basically on a scale of 0 to 10, how are you coping with the kids being home while you're at work today, when we use it like a coping question. And so this is a good question to ask. That's a good example, you know, how are you coping? And so people will say things like maybe a 5 or a 4. A lot of people will say a 4, you know, when you're asking a scaling question. In my experience, they may say something different than that, but it doesn't matter what they say, because you can use that to ask them then, you know, how would you move up 1 point on the scale? What would you have to do? What would be different, you know, in your life? What would you do? What would have to change? in the situation that you're in now, in your situational crisis that you're in now, to move up on the scale. And then you can also use it to compliment and point out their strengths. You can say, how did you manage to score so high on the scale? How did you manage to do that? Because some people tell you about very serious situations, but then they will also tell you that they're scoring higher on the scale. And then so you can ask them about that. Ask them why and how they managed to do that. How did they manage to do that? And then they can tell you about their coping and their strengths, and that brings that out in people. And one of the purposes of this complimenting too, and talking about the strengths, is we want people to recognize it in themselves, because we want them to gain confidence, as Jack was talking about, that they can actually cope and they can actually make it through. There's no way out, you have to go through. That's the philosophy here. I'm going to say that again. There's no way out. You have to go all the way through. And we want them to have the confidence that they can do that while they're in the crisis situation. So all of these scaling questions can be real helpful. Now, you can scale other things. You can scale their confidence that they can continue to go on, for example. How confident are you that you can continue to go on? And you can talk to them about that and how they can gain more confidence. You can also talk to them about their faith, like you would do in your setting, and ask them, where are you? How close are you to God now on the scale? How much faith do you have that we're going to be able to get through this crisis? You can scale anything like that. And what the scale does is it makes everything very concrete, like what Jack was talking about, very specific, so that you can talk to someone about what they need to do that's helpful. Next slide, please. In solution-focused counseling, we focus a lot on goals and the future. And that's really a part of the way we solve problems with people, as I mentioned. So these are some questions that you can actually use with your congregation that's really helpful in like setting a goal. So listening to people, when you hear someone say, this is what I want, that's basically what we mean by a goal. What does the person want? What do they want to happen? And what is their best hopes? And that's another way sometimes we ask the question. Would you say, what's your best hopes? What's your best hopes for the situation? But when you hear something, you can say, what is really important to you? So this is really important to you. It's really important to you to be able to find a little better way to connect with your friends at church while you're in the house. This is really important to you to find, some way to honor your mother's memory, even though you can't have a funeral right now. This is really important to you. These are important to you. Another question is, so what you want to see as different is, and these are like reflections now. These are like ways of conversational pieces, but they lead to questions. So what you want to see different is, and imagine that were to happen. And this is a really good situation, question in a crisis. That imagine what that were to happen, kind of thing, when people bring up a lot of things that you can't do, like having a funeral, having a wedding right now, or whatever. You can say, well, imagine that were to happen right now. How would that be? How would that be helpful to you? And of course, they would say, well, of course, we want to be able to, really appreciate my memory of my mother, because my mother means so much to me. And this is hard because we can't even grieve her loss. We can't even have a funeral. And you hear this a lot. This makes you feel bad as the pastoral care provider, because you're the one that usually does this and consoles families in that situation. But you have to say, no, we can't do that right now. So this would be, imagine that word, we could do that. Imagine, where that happened. And then they'll tell you things like that about their families. And then that gives you an opportunity then to explore some different ways that you can do that now. I've experienced, even though you have to postpone maybe a funeral to later. I have a friend that just lost her mother. She died at 5 a.m. just 2 days ago, and I was talking to her about these very topics like this, going over these topics where she's very distressed. So again, remember the steps. You'll be validating and you'll be very empathetic to the person about the situation, but then you can try to find out, imagine, that were to happen, then how would that be helpful to you? And then you can try to come up with something that will be helpful in the short term, like a short-term goal, until you can get to the long-term goal. Next slide, please. Goals and task questions are other questions that we use in solution-focused counseling. How could you do more of that this week? So when you actually, get to something that somebody wants to try and do different, or try something that has already worked for them, but do more of it, then you would switch into questions like this. How could you do more of that this week? How would that happen if you did this? You're already doing X, which could be something like you're already, schooling your children successfully, which helps you cope. What if you started doing something else with your children? What if you, gave a break, recess? That's in the schedule too. What if you did that a little longer than what they recommended? Would that make a difference? So you can add things like that. And the real important to this kind of thing too is you have a big goal. What would be a small step? Because you've got to stay with small steps toward the goal. In solution-focused counseling, you have to have small steps that people can actually accomplish. You want them to be able to accomplish something, because when they're able to make a positive step forward and accomplish something, again, this gives them confidence that they can keep going, and it gives them confidence that they can see their way through the crisis. They can go all the way through. There's no way out. You can't go up, you can't go down, but you can go all the way through. And so we want to communicate that to them. And so you can say, what did you think is a small step you could take that others would notice? That's a good question. What is a small step that you could take that others would notice? And then that also helps them to think out. And notice these questions are very, future oriented. That's like, what are you going to do next? They keep people from dwelling on the negative. They're negative emotions, things that have been failures in the past. It's almost like what you say to people, when they come to Christ. And that is, all things are new. Everything is different from here on. This is the next step. And that's the message that you are trying to communicate to people too, as they move forward, with goals and tasks in the solution-focused counseling approach. Next slide, please. When you have people that are in a crisis, sometimes they are very traumatized. They not only have anxiety and depression, but they can have panic attacks. They can get very sleepless. They can just be very traumatized. And when they're experiencing a lot of emotional crisis like that, or let's just say people have died all around them, like what Weiwen was describing. They've died, there's been so much loss and crisis as a result of this, then they're in a traumatic situation. They have a lot of emotions. They may be crying in their office. They may be really overwhelmed by their emotions. And you have to establish the emotional equilibrium that Jack was talking to you about. A good question for that is, what do you need? What do you need right now? What can we do right now? What do you need? And that's a very simple question. And then you just pause and you listen and you let people reflect on that and tell you what they need most. You can also say, what can we do first? What's the first thing we can do? What do you need first? There are so many things here. There's your mother dying. There's your grandmother in the nursing home. There's, all these members of the congregation that have the virus. But what do you need right now? What is the first thing, that can happen here, that would make a difference? What do we need to focus on now? So you break it down into little steps then. So you say, we can't solve everything at once, but we can focus on one little thing at a time. And that's what you want to do when you have someone that's in a lot of emotional need and crisis that's in your office. The other thing, it's really important to offer resources. You already know this, resources to help. That question, we visited before, what have you already tried, comes into place here, because maybe people have tried a lot of things and you don't want to, really offer them the same things they've already tried. It doesn't work. So offer a resource, that could help that they have not tried before. I would like to mention with that too, it's really important because there's not enough resources. You may not have enough resources to help all these people that will come to you for help. So it's important to garner resources, harness resources. Also, in looking at the strengths and resources in the people like Jack was talking about, but the resources that you can offer as a church or church community. So you'll want to look at where are the resources in other churches, work with your colleagues, in other churches to try to have as many resources as possible. And then you could also work with the community resources. That's really important with social workers and other community resources. People in this state, as they're losing their jobs, that's something that's going on. Y'all know that they need financial resources. They need resources to know how to connect to the government resources that are coming. They need resources to, they need support to, file for unemployment. They need resources for food at the food pantry. They need those kinds of things. And these are what we call concrete resources. And that would be something that you could also be involved and will be involved in helping people with. So refer the person and follow up. That's really important. Get a commitment from them, to follow through with the resource, or to follow through with what you're coming up with, what they need and how it will be provided. Get a commitment. That's important. And then refer the person and follow up. If you don't have time to follow up with everyone, because this can be very overwhelming with so many people calling on you every day. I have this with students. I have a student now who's every member of his family has the COVID-19 virus, every member. And then one of my own students, who's a professor in another school, is an alumni of the University of Texas at Austin School of Social Work, contacted me yesterday. She has the COVID. One of her daughters, she has 3 daughters, but one of her daughters has 105 temperature now. They're in New York. They cannot get testing. They cannot get to the hospital. They basically are telling her, anybody in New York that has the COVID-19 virus, you're not going to get tested. If you have the symptoms, you have it. Stay in your house. So she contacted me. I'm dealing with this. I'm dealing with these needs. So I understand. And you're going to be dealing with a lot of different needs. It's going to be overwhelming, but get a commitment, refer the person, and follow up. And if you can't do it all yourself, get somebody to help you do that. Get some people to help you follow up with this, because lately there's a little icon on the computer, where you're just a little rat and you're typing as fast as you can and you're on the Zoom as much as you can. And this is the way we all feel. And so we want to make sure we have enough helpers too when we refer people and follow up. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm may bring Jack and Weiwen even back into the conversation a little bit, because this is an activity that we have for you. This is homework. This is for the future. I know you don't want any more homework, especially if you're schooling your children, but this is something you can do to learn what we have been talking to you about today. We basically have been talking to you about how to solve manage a crisis, how to talk to people, what kinds of questions to ask. And this activity will help you walk through some of the things that we've gone over. But we won't do it here, of course, but you have a case, you have a story. You have a story about Christine. We call it cases because we're social workers. You're going to call it a story. It's just a person in your congregation that has needs. And this is Christine. And you can read through that on your own, and you can practice this, and you'll get better at what we've been talking about today. You'll be better. You can work through these questions. What difficult strengths and resources does Christine have? And what coping strategies has Christine been using? Are these strategies effective? And what could be some potential goals when working with Christine? To achieve the goals, what tasks, experiments could you set up with Christine? Jack or Weiwen, did you want to say anything about these 4 and how they might be able to practice more?
Weiwen?
So as far as I wrote this story based on a lot of the cases that I supervised with the social workers. So for Kristen, we first need to acknowledge that she is sort of in an emergency right now. She does not have enough food. She's experiencing food insecurity, and she lost her job. She is in need of cash to help her pay her rent and also her daughter's um, childcare. So we need to think about what strengths and what resources that she has in her community, and also what kind of coping strategies that she's using in that case, and help her to identify these areas to further elaborate on how to how to uh, assess her own situations and come up with some goals and tasks that she can help or she can perform to improve her own situation.
Yeah, we were thinking that after you get done with this, and if you have some time, you could read that over and then go back to the PowerPoint that goes along with this presentation and maybe, you know, look at or remember some of the slides and respond to some of the some of the parts of the situation that Christine's involved with, and maybe come up with, you know, specific kinds of ways or language you might use to talk to her based on, you know, some of the recommendations we made, and what kind of crisis is it she's involved with, and what's the status of the crisis, and what are some ideas she might use to reestablish coping. Because as we've talked about the whole time, you know, helping her to restore coping, even though she wants a solution, is the most important thing to do first.
Yes, thank you, Jack. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, these are some resources that we put together for you, and I hope they'll be helpful to you. One of them is the Church Leaders Counseling Resource Book, which is a book that I did with my colleagues at the University of Texas at Austin. It has a lot of contributors in it, including one of the sponsors, you know, of this program. I guess the main sponsor, Professor Sandy Aguilar, you know, who is an Assemblies of God minister. And I do want to thank her and thank the Assemblies of God Church for sponsoring this and sending it out. And this book would be helpful. It has a lot of different resources in it for you about how to counsel people with different needs in your congregation. This other book is a book I did, Solution Focused Brief Therapy in Alternative Schools. And even though it's written towards a school setting, it could be very useful to you, because the message that I want to give to you is that we're talking about having a solution-focused conversation and not being a therapist. And you might be thinking, well, can I really do this well? But I'm saying to you that Jack and I have trained all kinds of people to do this, you know, in different organizations. And I've trained them a lot in schools, but I don't mean just social workers and other mental health therapists, but train teachers, counselors, you know, the principal, the janitor, you know, we trained in this one school. And so you can just do this in passing. You can ask these kind of questions in a very brief manner as you're having conversations with people, as this book illustrates how they're asking classrooms or just teachers pulling people out in the hall real quickly when you don't have a lot of time to talk to people. And it shows how the questions, like the exception question that we went over today and the scaling question, how that can be really helpful to you. So we hope these resources will be helpful. There's one more slide with a resource on it that I want to make you aware of. And this is, you know, a really good protocol to follow. And Jack, you want to say something about this, because you actually wrote this to help people that work in community agencies, and all those people aren't necessarily professional mental health therapists. They're like youth workers and people that don't have a lot of training in social work or other counseling.
Right. There's our chapter in this book is a chapter about how solution-focused approach was integrated through all the programs in an organization here in Austin that I used to work with. And I wrote it with the current director of clinical services. And she and I put our heads together and looked at ways that you could, integrate solution-focused approach in a crisis intervention program, as well as in an emergency shelter. Now, the actual chapter doesn't get into the emergency shelter information aside from very peripherally, but we had also trained all the line workers and childcare workers in the facilities, as well as that program or that agency also had a federally funded runaway and homeless youth program for street outreach. And the street outreach workers were also trained to use these approaches. So basically we trained all the organization staff at all different levels, and probably at least 60% of them were not what we would consider professional licensed practitioners.
Yes, thank you, Jack. And so I think the main point here, is that you can use the solution-focused resources that we've given you, and the conversations, the questions, and what we're talking to you about today. Anyone could learn that. And, just like you as pastors work to equip people for the works of the ministry, you're equipping your congregation to be effective, to be helpers, and to be outreach people in the world for the sake of the gospel. We equip people in this way too and build capacity of people. And so these other resources are for spiritual practices during a crisis, and you'll be very familiar with these. We just put some scriptures here for you to think about that might be useful to you. One of them, the Galatians 6:9-10 scripture, though, I will point out, it does, say that we have to be helpful to as many people as we can all the time, especially to those of the household of God. And so part of what people want to be doing in your churches and what you be doing is helping one another, supporting one another through this. This is important for social support. Is very important to overcoming crisis, like Jack said. So making sure there's enough social support, enough human connection at this time, that's going to be really important for people to get through the crisis. And these other scriptures are really meant to point out that we all go through storms, and we can go through those storms, and we don't have to, be overcome by the storms. And these are messages that, of course, come from the Bible. We're all in a process of having to overcome different things, and we can grow through that. And that's the point of that. So I think it's really helpful if you keep a journal of how God is helping you through crisis, instead of just thinking about all the problems. That's the gratitude journal of how this can help you. It will make you more thankful. It will make you more grateful. One of the things you can do in solution-focused work is to develop stories of hope. We did that. I work with people that, were working with a crisis in Japan, where a lot of people died, when they had the tsunamis and the volcanoes and those things like that. And one of the things they did is on their website, they developed stories of hope. Stories of hope. People wrote in stories of hope, just like what Weiwen was saying. He heard many stories of hope. And so you can have people write that down. And of course, the prayers are very important for yourself, others, and the leaders. And then meeting the needs of the community is really important, as well as keeping the online connections. So the next slide, this is minister self-care. And we really haven't mentioned yet, but Professor Aguilar put this slide in here. None of us can be effective helpers. You cannot be an effective pastoral care helper if you allow the burdens of the world to, take you down. Just think in the Bible about the story of Moses and how he couldn't keep his hands up. We have to have helpers to help us. And so these are some things that she put on here to think about. And I do agree with them. They're very good. You have to have some time alone. You can't just be with people all the time. You have to be able to have some people you can trust and open up to during this time. And of course, you know, you really need a support group around you, and that would be your colleagues, really your other ministry friends that are there that could support you. There's probably many other resources that you can tap into through the Assemblies of God Church. You know, I hope you'll look into those resources. You know, they're providing you. Professor Aguilar is wonderful at providing resources to you. And so, you know, we hope all of these resources will be helpful to you, and that you can take these and that you can become more effective ministers during this time of crisis to your congregation. You know, today we, you know, basically brought you a video training sponsored by Professor Sandy Aguilar and her ministry. And we wanted you ministers in the Assemblies of God Church to learn how to respond to people in crisis. That's what this video is about. And we went over how to manage a crisis, you know, the importance of coping first in a crisis. We also went over, you know, with you some very specific questions, good questions, solution-focused questions, how to have a solution-focused conversation, and we are offering these resources. And so we are very hopeful that this training will be helpful to you as you move forward in coping yourselves with the COVID-19 crisis. And thank you very much. And Jack and Weiwen, please say goodbye, you know, as we're signing off now. And, you know, bye-bye.